Hey guys, what's up? So in the background, you'll see some honest non-twink random co-op sessions and some honest non-twink invasions, and I'll touch a bit more on that in a moment. But I think in the recent hubbub about whether or not solo hosts should be invadable, and my mind's changing here a little bit, I think we shouldn't lose sight of what I consider to be one of the most pernicious issues in Souls multiplayer, and that's twinking. I think a lot of the concerns that I'm hearing recently about solo hosts being invaded are actually concerns about twinking, and I think concerns about twinking are one of the few legit concerns that people can have about invasions in these games. I've actually heard people suggest that we should get rid of solo host invasions to protect people from twinking, and that seems completely backwards to me. Let's solve the twinking problem first. That's the problem we need to be attacking. So let's start with what I consider to be some basic principles of multiplayer and game design, and I think we should all be able to rally around these sort of basic points. And the first is multiplayer should be balanced, and I want to note, balance does not mean equal, but the games have to be balanced. Invasions are at their best when the outcomes are uncertain. They shouldn't serve as instant death sentences for hosts. When a host sees that they've been invaded, that should not be the same as knowing for a fact that they're going to die. But they shouldn't be death sentences for invaders either. The entire invasion ecosystem depends on it. It depends on there being some uncertainty about the outcome, and that's what makes them entertaining in the first place. So if we're gonna fix a problem, we really need to understand it first. And in order to understand twinking, we need to get to the bottom of why people are doing it. I often hear people uncategorically denounce invaders for twinking, and I think that's too simplistic a viewpoint. It's actually a difficult decision whether or not to twink, and let's talk about why people do it. The first is to grief other players, and this is the most obvious reason that somebody might choose to do this, and I can't emphasize how bad this is. Somebody who's just starting a Souls game for the first time, they're at high wall, they're trying to get their feet wet, they don't understand the game, they don't understand anything about the mechanics. To throw invasions at that player is bad enough, but for them to have to deal with a twink, that's ridiculously difficult. Myself, I have trouble with twinks, even twinks that are way worse players than I am, because the gear differential at that point makes such a big difference. So hopefully we can all agree that these types of twinks have no place in the game. The other type, though, is to compete against other twinks. That's the other reason that twinks do it. It's the reason I do it. Often it's the reason people claim they do it, but is it really the reason they do it? And I can think sometimes it's a bit difficult to say. And this really puts Reds in a pickle, because you can twink, and if you do, then you're gonna be able to compete against the other twinks, but you're gonna blow new players away. On the other hand, if you choose not to twink, then you're gonna be ridiculously outgunned by the hosts and phantoms that are twinking. Now, I know some players claim that they twink, but they don't take advantage of new players or players that don't have twinked out gear, and frankly, I don't really believe this, at least not for the most part. People cultivate all sorts of excuses about why they have to do something. I cannot tell you how many times I've built a new character, been invaded, the other player's not using obvious twink gear, I start kicking their ass, and what happens? The DSA comes out, they start bringing out lightning bundles, and yeah, the DSA moveset isn't that great, but when it does so much damage and they've got a parry tool, and you know one mistake could end your life, it becomes a pretty difficult matchup to deal with. Plus, they can out-heal against you by an immense amount. That's a really difficult situation to be in, and funny enough, G9 actually made a related point in one of his most recent videos, which is that people abuse tools, and in the context of his discussion, it was around the use of Cheat Engine, and G9 made the observation that every player he knew, without exception, every player that used Cheat Engine, they may not use it primarily in a way that is objectionable, but every player he said that he knew had used it in that way at least once. And you can understand why. It's tempting. When you've got the tools there to deal with somebody who's annoying you, it's always tempting to use them. And when you're a twink, it's always tempting to use twink tools to deal with a host or a group of phantoms that might be giving you a hard time, even if truthfully, it's really not justifiable. So then what does From really need to do about this? Well, they need to solve the twinking problem. How do they do that? I have a couple ideas and a couple thoughts. I think the first and maybe most important issue is if you're going to solve the twinking problem, it really means solving two problems. First of all, you have to eliminate the ability of Reds to twink, but you also have to eliminate the ability for hosts and phantoms to twink. That also means You've got to do something about over-leveled phantoms and their powers. Because if you take away the power from reds, but you leave it with hosts, that's essentially going to kill low-level invasions, and that brings us back to the ecosystem problem. If reds are so discouraged they don't want to invade, it totally ruins the whole mechanic. I think From clearly sees this as an issue. You can see the evolution of their gameplay over time. They've made very large strides toward trying to tackle this problem. They had some missteps with soul memory. Soul memory was not a great solution, but it did definitely help mitigate the twink problem, at least initially. Dark Souls 3, they added weapon and soul level matching, which I think is great, and that's gone a long way to reduce the problems of twinking. And I hear a lot of players say Dark Souls 3 isn't nearly as bad as earlier games, and that's true, but it's still pretty bad and it still has room for improvement. And I think frankly, even one simple change would take away probably 90% of the twink's power. And that's simply Estus matching. And I don't mean Estus matching in the sense that you can only invade people that are within an Estus range or they're the same upgrade as you. Instead, what I mean is, imagine anybody that invades a host or any phantoms that are summoned into that host's world, they get that host's Estus upgrade level. If the host is new and has +1 Estus, well then you get +1 Estus, just as the phantoms do. Now how many of those you should get, that's really a gameplay balance question. Bloodborne gives the invader as many healing items as the host. Dark Souls 3 gives you half as many. I've made the point in previous videos that I think that number is actually tied to the speed of heals. The faster the heals are, the less punishable they are, and therefore to bring parity, you need to give invaders and hosts and phantoms roughly the same number of heals. Now, does that completely solve the twinking problem? Of course it does not. There's always going to be issues. There's always going to be ways that players are going to seek to get an advantage. There's problems like weapons that are unnaturally effective, like the Dragon Slayer axe is a great example. That can be handled through, I think, some simple weapon balancing. You've got problems like items. Certain items are unnaturally effective at a low level. Lightning bundles, for example. Lightning bundles aren't accessible till late game. Players that use those in the early game, it roughly doubles the damage that you do, and that is a big deal. That's a huge balance problem. I mean, it's essentially the equivalent of somebody with +5 weapons fighting somebody with +1. That's a problem. And then you've got things like rings, the prisoner's chain, FAP, etc. One idea I had was you could set minimum soul levels for those sorts of items. So you have to be at a certain soul level before you can use those. I think that would be a great way to solve the problem. Honestly though, if those were the only things that we had to worry about, I don't think it would be such a big deal. I don't necessarily have a problem with somebody going into the later game to get some items that they can use in the early game, provided it doesn't give them too big an advantage. Prisoner's Chain is probably on the fence there. It may be too big an advantage, but I think we can tolerate a certain amount of that. I think this problem is relatively easily solved, or at least easily mitigated. In other words, we can solve it enough that it doesn't become such a big problem. We're not turning new players off of the game, and we're not letting the first experience somebody has with invasions be somebody like this who's twinking specifically with the goal of griefing new players. We don't want players like that to be the ambassadors for us. You guys know I argue with people on Reddit a lot. I have a lot of discussions about the suitability of the invasion mechanic, but I have to admit, for new players that are getting invaded by twinks, that's not a fun experience. It's a bad experience. It turns people off of the game. It turns people off the invasion mechanic. It makes them that much more likely to disconnect at soul level 80 because the only experiences that they've had with invaders has been poor. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care of yourselves.